Okay. We
listen to on top last video time now for one. Somebody want to pass some break. When we come back, plenty for baby. Oh yeah, I'm going for the we keep it sound of Lagos. No, we last week. 90.1 FM, your number one. Wow, next station. My people, drink water.
I hope you can all hear me before I start because I will do a set in such a way that no participant will be able to unmute in the course of the lecture. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can all hear you, sir.
Because I was hearing a very disturbing noise at the background. And the person kept unmuting himself. I wonder why the fellow is behaving like that. Okay. Okay. Let's start with the class. Today we are going to look at Echelon theory of trade. It is a follow-up to classical theories we'll discuss. The Ricardian theory and Smith theory of the trade. At the end of the class, learners are expected to be able to outline the assumption of Echelon theory, explain what is meant by factor intensity and factor abundance, and be able to discuss how Echelon model determine the basis of trade. And those are the major outcomes that will be expected of the participant, of the student at the end of this lecture. This give the photo, this is a photograph of the two scholars, the two Swedish scholars who actually propounded the theory. The first one is Eli Ekscher, and from the word Eli Ekscher, the word Ekscher was removed, and from Betty Holly, the other name was actually removed, making the two actually work on the theory simultaneously, and they collaborated, and that actually gives us an idea of what the two scholars actually did, and majorly we can then move from there and look at what are those key assumptions of that theories. Majorly the assumption of classical theory are largely carried over to Echelon theory, and that's the assumption of two countries, two commodities, and the like. These major assumptions are very important, in discussion of Echelon theory, and you have to really take time to explain some of these assumptions. The first one is two country, two products. We assume that there are two countries who actually want to engage in trade, country A, nation B. And the next one is, two factors of production. We want to assume that there are two factors of production, which are labors and capital. And same technology in production. We want to believe that the two countries involved in this theory, they have the same level of technology. No one is more technologically advanced. Neither of the two. Either of the two is more technologically advanced, and that's very important to actually, for the explanation we are going to offer in discussing the theory. Constant return to scale between factor of productions and output, meaning that constant return to scale is not different from what you are used to in your basic microeconomics. That means for each quantity of factors you add to your production process or to your production function, you are going to get the same number of outputs. That means there's constant factor. If you increase your input, let's say labor, by 3, you're going to get 3 more additional output. And if you do the same for capital, you're going to get the same number of increasing quantity of output. Commodity X is labor intensive. We assume that the two commodities, one of them is labor intensive and the other one is capital intensive. That is commodity X. In this case now, we assume that commodity X is labor intensive, while commodity Y is capital intensive. Furthermore, we also assume an assumption of perfect competitions in both commodities and factor markets. We believe that the assumption of perfect competition that we are already used to in our basic micro, that no producer can actually influence the price it can raise its price above the market price, or is strong enough to influence the price and at the general price level of the market, both in the commodity market and the factor market. These are key assumptions that will be very important to explaining Echelon theory. Now, before we really go ahead to explain the theory, there's need for us to explain some basic concepts. And let's start with factor intensity. When you say factor intensity, what do you mean by the concept of factor intensity? The first one is that if we have a commodity that uses more labor than capital, we can say absolutely that such a commodity is labor intensity. But the fact still remains that we cannot just say that we are not looking at absolute value. We are looking at ratio, ratio of labor per capita. Since we assume that each of the combination of labor and capital will be required to produce each commodity. We want to see that if a commodity uses higher labor than capital. That is, if labor all over capital is greater than one, you can then say that such commodity uses more labor and is labor intensity. And the reverse is the case for all the other commodity. If capital over labor, that is, if a particular commodity uses more capital than labor, that means the ratio of capital to labor will be greater than one. That's what we mean by labor intensity. We're not looking at it from the absolute sense. We're looking at it from you know the ratio, or in terms of percentage of labor that is actually used at the expense of the other factor of production, in this case, a capital. So that's what we're actually interested in. And as we have here, in a world of two commodity, two factors, we say that commodity Y is capital intensive if the capital labor ratio KL used in the production of Y is greater than KL used in the production of X. E.g., if 2 units of capital, 2K, and 2 units of labor are required to produce 1 unit of capital Y, of commodity Y, and capital labor ratio is K all over L, it gives us 1 in the production of Y. At the same time, you can then say that capital labor ratio for the commodity, and you can actually read it, but basic things that we are not looking at it from the absolute angle, we are looking at it from the ratio, in terms of ratio of capital and labor that is actually expended to produce a particular commodity. And graphically, we can look at this graph, factor intensity and factor abundance. Now, in the first graph, nation one actually look at, we have a graph. We have two graphs, but for nation one and nation two. In the first graph, there's a particular line that is not very clear. And let's start with that particular line that is not very clear. You can see 2 points of tangency, where we have y1, y2, and on that line, k all over l, in production of y is equal to 1. That means the same quantity of capital that is required to produce y, it also the same quantity of labor that is required to produce that particular commodity. That means k all over l give us 1, meaning that the product is neither does not require, it's not capital intensity or labor intensity. Now that means the two are equal to 1. But if you go down, there's another line that actually shows k all over l in x, in production of x. That means that k all over l in that shows that there's 1 all over 4. This case, that means it uses more capital than than labor. That means commodity X is labor intensive, and Y commodity Y can be actually considered to be more of a capital, though the two products are equal in their production. When you now look at nation two producing commodity Y, nation two, there's another line that is not clear. Nation two uses K all over L in nation two in production of Y is equal to 4. That means nation two uses more of capital than labor to produce commodity Y. Why the same nation uses more of commodity, capital to produce X, and K all over L in that country is give us 1. That means just the reverse of what we have in nation A. That means nation A is capital, uses more of capital, while one, nation one uses more of labor, while nation two uses more of capital. Now, moving away from intensity, let's look at what we mean by abundance. When you say a particular resource, a particular country has a particular factor of production in abundance, we are not the same thing we apply in the case of factor intensity, the same thing we are going to apply in the same in factor abundance. In the case of factor abundance, we are not really looking at like in absolute value, you say that a country like China is labor abundant, while a country like United States of America is capital abundant. But when you look at is we are looking at in terms of its relativity, we're looking at in terms of capital vis-a-vis the the labor available. And in the case of China, we are looking at capital labor vis-a-vis the quantity of capital that is available in that economy. Factual abundance can be defined in two ways. First, in terms of physical units. That is, physical unit is the absolute terms, what you can say, in terms of overall amount of capital available to each nation. That's what I just said. That in the case of China, we have, or the surface countries like China, India, I would say they are labor. Even Nigeria, we say we are labor abundant, meaning that we should focus more on products that consume more labor. That's ordinarily what the theory of Echelon would predict for such an economy. In terms of relative factors, we're also looking at it in terms of relative factor. When you look at capital vis-a-vis the labor, you can then say whether a country is capital intensive or labor intensive, as the case may be. As the case may be. Now, factor according to the definition in terms of physical units, nation two is capital abundant if the ratio of total number of capital to the total number of labor available in nation two is greater than one. For instance, on the surface now, you say that based on this absolute physical unit now, you can say country like China is labor abundant than country like United States, and you can say that country like Nigeria is labor abundant than country like South Africa. No, that's just on the physical unit side. But if you move away from the physical unit side, we look at it from the relative, in terms of relative or in terms of price that we pay to get labor. Now, in a country like China, it's possible that the price of capital is cheaper, and we all know the reward for capital is rent. Can we remember that? Sorry, it's interest, and the reward for labor is wage. If the interest rate of capital in a country like China is cheaper than interest rate of capital in a country like United States, we then say capital is more abundant in a country like China and than US. But the reality on ground is that country like United States has one of the least interest rates in the world, one of the least interest rates in the world, while country like Nigeria has one of the highest interest rates in the world. And from that definition, you can generalize that country like China and US is more capital intensive based on what they pay as interest rates on the capital. And by the time you look at this ratio as well, you can easily conclude now that is price of capital, which is interest rate, price of labor, which is wage. You can then see that if PK, price of capital, all over price of labor, is lower in nation two than nation one, you then say that nation two is capital abundant and nation one is not capital abundant. And if the reverse is the case for nation one, you can then say that nation one is labor abundant and nation two is capital abundant. That actually prepare ground for the discussion of the theory. And going on the surface of it, the discussion of the theory is majorly predicated on the statement made by, graphically, we can then look at this graph and it depicts which country is capital and modern to which one. From this graph now, the nation two has like 140 of Y, which is going to produce maybe using more of a capital as we discussed earlier, and nation two can as well produce similar quantity using more of labor. That means the two countries are, in their production process are going to combine a bit of capital and a bit of labor to actually achieve production process. Now, I won't discuss that. Let's look at let's have some little discussions on what we mean by capital abundance and labor abundance. And since nation two is capital abundant nations and nation Y is capital abundant, we can then decide, or generally, let me give you what the theory is all about. The theory of Echelon basically tells us that a particular country should produce more of commodity that uses more of available resources, available input, if it is capital or labor, and export that commodity. In return, such countries should import more of products that consume less of capital that does not have. That means that if country A is labor, if nation A is labor abundant, such country should produce commodity that requires more of labor and export such commodities. And in return, import commodity that uses more of capital that is not abundant in such economy from other countries. That means the direction of trade is going to be determined by abundance of factor of productions. And the abundance of factor of production, as we discussed earlier, is basic. Is basic. You can easily, by that predictions, that you will only expect country like China, which is labor abundant. When you look at the physical units, to export product that is labor intense, that uses more of labor, that is labor intensified. But what we see in most cases is that you know those that prediction is not followed through by many countries, and that's what we call paradox of there's a Leontief paradox that actually explain why some countries in the course of the discussion, we're going to look at lengthy paradox as well. But basically, what the theory of Exhaling is telling us is that a country should export more of commodity that consume or that require more of product, more factor of production that is abundantly available in such economy. The same thing goes for Nigeria. We ordinarily expect a country like Nigeria to export more of product that consume more labor. Now that means that in that thinking or in that line, but the fact is the case in these current situations. Now, moving away from that discussions, let's look at factor abundance and shape of the production process. Production positive frontier. We have nation two. We have two nations, nation one and nation two. Nation one produces what can produce using all the capacity available. That means using the available factor of production, capitals and labor. Nation two can produce 140 commodity of Y, and produces 80 commodity of X. And the same thing goes for nation two. Nation two can as well, using all the existing capacity, can produce 140x commodity, and at the same time produce 70 commodity of Y. That is when there is no trade, when the two countries are not into any form of trade. And since nation and from this now, we then know that nation two, based on our previous discussion, we know that nation two is capital abundant nations and commodity Y is capital intensive commodity. Nation two can produce relatively more of commodity Y than nation one. On the other hand, since nation one is a labor abundant nations and commodity X is labor intensive, nation one can produce relatively more of commodity X than nation two. That's what is actually obvious in that analysis. Going by extraordinary, as I explained earlier, a nation will export a commodity whose production require the intensive use of the nation relatively abundant and cheap factors, and import the commodity whose production require intensive use of. I think I've explained this earlier, and that is the key message in this theory. And if you can actually understand the key message in this theory, that's what the theory. That's the major. Any other thing we do is just to give some basic analysis on economic analysis to the theory. But the key message in the theory is that the nation should actually endeavor to export commodity that uses more of abundant factor of production that the country has, and import the country that does not and import commodity that does not require, that use less of the commodity that country such that is not available in such an economy. And extraordinary, and this just this gives more credence to what is a further discussion to what we discuss about the theory. Thus, the Shaolin theorem explains comparative advantage rather than assuming it. Based on this explanation, instead of explaining why a particular country or why, or in the case of Ricardian, where the issue of comparative advantage is taken or is given, this Shaolin or HO theorem actually provide the explanation that you will have a comparative advantage in the production of a particular commodity that uses more of abundant factors in such an economy. If such country is not does not abundantly flex with a particular factor that commodity production of that commodity require, there's no way you will have a comparative advantage in that in the production of that commodity. That means that this theory is not only giving us, not only explaining what comparative advantage is all about, it's actually explaining it. That is, you're going to have a comparative advantage in any commodity, in production of any commodity, as long as you are blessed with the factor that is required to produce that commodity. Um, And this is something we have to be very familiar with. But we have a paradox that provide an exemption to this explanation. This difference, this difference is a relative factors and relative commodity price is then translated into different in absolute factor and commodity price between the two nations. And this just is a follow up to what we've discussed. Now, generally, it is believed that Extra-Olin theorem or HO theory is a general equilibrium theory. Why do we regard it as a general equilibrium theory? A whole of, like, we never regarded comparative advantage theory propounded by Ricardian as general equilibrium theory. And the same thing goes for Adam Smith. We never regarded them as a general equilibrium theory. But we are regarding HO theory because these are issues that that might require discussion or that you might be asked to discuss. Like, why is HO regarded as HO regarded as a general equilibrium theory? It is regarded merely as general equilibrium theory, but because it encompasses the activities in the market. In any typical market, you are going to be discussing the price of commodity and the price of the factor of productions. And when you are looking at this, looking at this diagram, let's start from the bottom. Demand for final commodity. The demand for final commodity is actually determined by distribution of factor of productions and takes in the market. The factor of production will be combined to produce a commodity that people want. And the same thing go for derived, the factor of production. Factor of production is a derived demand because it is demanded because of what you can produce with with the factors. And this factor, the factor price is determined by the supply of factor of productions. That is, the supply of factor of production determines the price in the market, and the technology also determines the commodity. That means any theory that encompasses both the supply side and the demand side of the market can be regarded. And we are not talking of just the price of commodity. We're also talking of the factor of productions in this case. In this case now, we can easily regard HO theory as general equilibrium theory that encapsulates the activities in the market, and that provides us a very veritable tools to analyze the theory. And now this slide basically explain in more details what I've actually explained to you, and you can as well read it and get a better understanding of what I've explained. And let's go to the difference in relative price and okay, the same thing goes for this. Graphical illustrations. Now, based on this theory, how do we arrive at how country actually benefit from trade? Country majorly benefit from trade when you look at it graphically. The first graph depicts or shows us a pre-trade arrangement, an autarchical arrangement before the trade takes place. It provides information, it depicts information about the two nations involving, potential, you know, two countries that will involve in trade. And the second graph gives information, it provides information when trade has taken place between these two important countries. In the first graph, we have nation one, nation two, and there's a first indifference curve, I, or you call it one, as the case may be. And point we have 2 points, point A factorial and point A. That shows the points where indifferent curve is tangential to production possibility curve of the country, and that shows the point at which the utility is maximized at that in that country. That means at that country, at let's say for nation one now, we have at point A, that's the utility, that's under utility one, that's where the two country, that's where nation A maximizes the utility. And the same thing goes for nation B, I mean nation two, where we have A factorial. That's a picture where nation two also maximizes their utility. The price at that point is PA for nation A and PA factorial for country, for nation two. And under that arrangement, indifferent curve two, which is an higher indifference curve, which provide higher level of consumptions, is unattainable at that level for the two countries because they have to, is either something changed fundamentally for them to attain that. And let's move to the second graph. At the right side of the panel, We then have the two nation under this panel, under this graph now, the two nations have started to engage in international trade. And the fundamental information about utility curve of the first utility curve is still there. We still have inside now. We now have A factorial and A that they pay the earlier in different, the level of satisfaction or the maximum or the optimum satisfaction, the optimum for satisfaction for the international trade. The different curve two that used to be unattainable now, as a result of the exchange involvement in international trade of the two countries in different of two is now attainable, and it shows higher consumptions for the two commodity, and it also show the equilibrium where A is equal to A prime for the two countries. That means as a result of the international trade being engaged by the two countries can now operate at higher indifference curve, which shows with the depict higher consumptions for the two countries. The slide that follow basically explain all of this in more detailed forms, and you can actually read them up to have a better understanding of what I just explained to you. There is another sub-theory under HO theory. We call it factor price equalizations. Let me explain in a very simple language to you. The factor equalization believes that if two countries engages in trade, let's take for instance now the wage in Nigeria and US is far far apart, and the two countries start to engage in trade. If the two countries at the onset, let's assume that the wage in Nigeria is just per hour is just a $1, and the wage in US is like $5. Over times it is expected based on this factor equalization theory as propounded by has been propounded as one of the agent theories in HO theory, that the two countries over time, the wage in the two countries will start to equalize. Equalization means that they tend towards equality, tend towards equality, that the two will start to be the same. That means the wage rate in Nigeria will move from $1 tending towards like two, and that of the US will also tend to reduce and converging to the what wage rate is in Nigeria. And the same thing go for something like capital, like interest rates. The interest rates, if of the two countries they start engaging in trade, they tend to equalize. How realistic is this theory? This factor price equalization theory is another thing entirely. But that's what the theory is actually telling us, that over time, if the two countries engage in trade, the factor of production, the price of factors in those two countries tend to equalize or tend to converge over a period of time. But it has a preconditions. The precondition is that those factors must be of equal level of, let's say for instance now for labor, the labor in two countries must expected to be of equal level of skills. That means they must have acquired the same level of skill, the same level of training, and all that for the convergence to actually take place. But if they do not, that's an exemption to that theory. This may not actually be obtainable in that situations. That means that international trade will bring about equalization in the relative and the absolute return to homogeneous factors across. There's a condition that the factor in this, we are discussing must be homogeneous. And let's say for instance, now labor, when you say labor is homogeneous, they are of the same level of skill, the same level of training, and they can actually offer the same level of productivities. That's what we mean by factor price equalization. And if the same thing go for capital as well, if they are of equal, or if the capitals are of equal qualities in terms of investable opportunities, they should actually be of, the interest rate in the two countries engaging in trade should actually converge as well. That's another fundamental sub theory under HO theory. And it's very important. I can ask you why, there is possible that you have an exception to this theory. There's no doubt about that. But it's just a proposition propounded by a scholar, which we can actually. Similarly, international trade will cause the return in homogeneous capital of the same productivity and risk to be the same in all trading nations. That is, international trade would make W the same in the nation one and two. Okay, that's W stand for interest rate in this case. It will cause R to be the same in both nations. Both relative and absolute factor will be equalized. The theory was propounded by Robisky, and I think yes, it was propounded by Robisky. He's one of the people that actually help to propound more of HO theory. And I want to discuss what the theory is all about. Let's look at as research scholars are restless. They can be restless sometimes. I've propounded this beautiful theory. empirically this theory can be investigated, and a whole lot of efforts have gone into investigating how realistic is this theory of Echelon theory. And the first thing that came up in this is Loenzi paradox. Loenzi paradox found that exports were less capital intensive than US import. That is, exports that US that we believe is capital endowed or capital as capital in abundance. The export that goes out of US is less capital intensive compared to the imports that come to US. That means US import more of capital intensive than the exports. And by default, you expect a country that is capital endowed to export more of capital, intensive products and imports more of labor intensive products. But the reverse is the case in the case of US, and that turned out to be what we call Lorenzi paradox because it depicts an exception to the theory of Echelon. And other scholars have actually worked to actually see. But the results coming from these two majorly, these two research majorly, is mixed. Some will support the fact that the the actual theory is actually real, and some will counter it with other empirical results. But by and large, there are empirical results that have shown that the theory is absolutely true, and some have shown that the reverse is the case. Let's take a test in South Korea for, I mean, not South trade, for instance. Now, not South trade in manufacturers seem to be fit to a Shaolin theory much better than the overall pattern of international trade. The case of missing trade, and that's another one now that actually shows depicts or show another thing that's proof. This is another evidence that Shaolin theory is not as expected. Now, in summary, we've discussed a Shaolin theory in which two goods are produced using factor of production emphasize the role of resources in trade, and with the predictions arising from that theory, we've discussed it. A country that uses intensively its abundant factor and import a country will export the commodities which uses intensively its abundant factors and import commodity which uses intensively its scarce factors, which is the major things the theory is all about. And that with that we come to the end of the class, and going forward we are going to welcome questions from the students, and I hope the class with the lecture was interesting.